This next fly we're going to tie is a gold rib hare's ear. This is an old pattern that's been around a long time and one of the most popular around. This fly will teach a lot of different techniques, so this is one to really pay attention to. A lot of nymph patterns are based off the same premise as this fly. It's going to have a tail, a rib, an abdomen, a wing case, and a thorax. And all nymph patterns have some combination thereof, so this is a good fly to have just sort of as a pattern reference to use in a lot of other flies. In this case, we're going to start off with a 2x long, 2 extra heavy nymph hook. This is a Tiemco 5262, and in this case it's a size 12. We're going to use 6/0 tan thread. The tail is going to be made out of mottled henback. We're going to use just a few fibers off of a mottled henback feather for the tail. The rib is small gold wire. The abdomen and thorax are going to be dubbed from hare's mask dubbing, and I'll show you how we'll mix that up here in just a second. And the wing case is a mottled turkey tail quill. So to start on this fly, actually before we get started, I'm going to show you how we're going to mix the dubbing to create the abdomen and thorax. We're going to take this hare's mask, and I'll take my scissors. I'm going to go in against the grain right down the center of the mask. The darker hair down the center is what we're going to use for the thorax of this fly. We're going to use some of the longer, softer hair along the cheeks for the abdomen. I've already got the stuff for the abdomen mixed up here, so I'll just mix up a new batch of the darker hair for the thorax. So I'm going to take my scissors as close to the hide as I can, and typically I'd go through and trim this whole mask out. I'm going to trim this hair down as close to the skin as I can, and I'll pull that clump of hair out. And I'll show you here, while we've got this in this state, why we're going to use hare's mask dubbing instead of conventional rabbit dubbing. Hare's mask dubbing has got some really stiff, dark colored and mottled guard hairs. It's also got, you can see the grayish colored stuff here, some really soft underfur. The catch being those spiky guard hairs make a really buggy looking fly, but they're very hard to dub because they're so stiff. The soft underfur dubs on very nicely, but leaves no bugginess to the fly. It's very handy that a hare's mask grows just exactly the right mixture when we mix this dubbing together to give us a nice soft binder fur that will dub tightly onto the thread with the guard hairs that still stick out. To mix this up, you can use the old conventional coffee grinder technique, or I'll show you a new trick that I came up with a couple years ago. I'm going to take this little pinch of dubbing, and I've got a Ziploc bag here, and I've poked a few holes in this Ziploc bag just with the tips of my scissors. You don't need very big holes, but you do want enough holes that we're going to push some air in here. We want that air to be able to go in and out of the bag. So I'll take this clump of dubbing, I'll put it in the bag, and I'll zip the bag almost all the way down. I'm just going to leave the corner open. I'll take a can of air, like you'd dust your computer with. I'm going to put the nozzle in the bag and zip up tight around it. Now, one of the tricks on this is don't tilt the can when you do this. You want to try to keep the can horizontal, or the spout horizontal, so that you don't freeze the hair. If you tilt the can, it'll freeze all the hair and it'll ruin it. So we want to keep everything level. I'm going to keep the bag pinched closed, and I'm going to blast a long shot of air through here, and that's going to stir all that dubbing together into a nice mix of guard hair and underfur where it's all pre-done in a bag. Really a handy way to mix up some dubbing. You can use little tiny small amounts in a small bag. You can use larger amounts in a much bigger bag, but really pretty mess-free and easy to work with. So we're going to do that with some of the darker hair from the center of the mask, and then what I've done here is the longer hair on the sides of the mask. You can tie a hare's ear all with the dark hair, or with the light colored softer hair for the abdomen and the dark hair for the thorax. I wouldn't generally tie the whole fly out of all the soft hair. It just doesn't get the bugginess factor that is sort of inherent in a hare's ear. So we're going to set this mask aside, and we'll get started tying the fly. I'm going to start my thread at about the 60% point on the hook here, and I'm going to wrap a thread base back to the bend. On this hook, a good way to tell when you're at the bend is the thread will hang right even with the point on the barb. And at that point, I'm going to take and just strip off one of these mottled hen feathers. I'll use a little bit larger one here just for the sake of being easy to use. I'll strip the fluff off the bottom, And I'm going to draw out a clump of these fibers so that their tips become square. You can see as they're naturally on the feather, they're slightly tapered. If I draw them out at more of a right angle, those tips will square up a little more. I'll grab that clump and strip the rest of the feather away. Now I'm going to take this clump and just sort of roll it into a nice little bundle. I'm going to measure it against the hook shank, so it's about a half shank long. I'll transfer it to my material hand and lay it in here at the bin and capture it with just a couple turns of thread. And I'll wrap forward over those butt ends to just past the halfway point on the hook, and I'll trim the stubs off. Now the rib on this is going to be gold wire. You can use gold tinsel as well, but I find the gold wire is a little more subtle and a lot more durable. So I'll take this piece of small gold wire and I'm going to tie it in at the front end of the body. I'll lay it in my right angle here between the hook shank and the thread, and I'll wrap back over this all the way back to the bend. Now when I tie this wire down, I want to make sure, particularly at the bend, that I've got it really anchored in place well so that it doesn't lift or turn as we wrap the fly. Now we're going to dub the abdomen. And in this case we're going to do a multi-step taper. So I'm going to use some of this lighter colored dubbing, the softer stuff from the edges of the mask. And I've put just a little bit of dubbing wax on my fingers. I'm going to draw out a length of thread. And this dubbing, being shorter than some of the synthetics that we've already used, needs to be applied in smaller increments. So you can see I'm moving my left hand much slower than I was with the longer dry fly dubbing. But I still want to keep the dubbing on the thread as tightly as I can and as consistently as I can. I don't want any lumps or bumps or skinny spots as I come down the thread. And in some cases you may need to apply more than one layer of dubbing, or I may need to come back and add some. One of the rules on dubbing is always go a little thin. You can always add more, but if you put too much on, it's hard to get off, particularly if you do it right. So I've got maybe a 1/6" length of dubbing here. I'm going to bring my thread right up to the end, and you can see that I've got a bare inch or so of thread here between the top of the dubbing strand and the hook shank. I'm going to use that bare thread here to wrap back to the bend of the hook. I'll use that bare thread up on my way back so that my first turn of dubbing is right at the base of the tail. From there I'm going to put just one turn in front of the other, perhaps just slightly overlapping the wraps, as I work forward up to about the 70, maybe even 75% point on the hook. So I've got a single layer of dubbing all the way up the hook. Now is where I'm going to build my taper. I'm going to come back over the front half of that abdomen, and I'll continue over the front third to build a little bit more taper there. Now as I start to run out of dubbing, I want to make sure that I've got a nice taper there that's fatter at the front and skinnier at the back. The hare's ear, particularly in this size, is a little chunkier bug than a lot of the stuff we've tied so far, so it's okay that it's a little bulkier. Now I'm going to wrap my rib, and I'm just going to spiral wrap this rib through the dubbing, and it's not going to be terribly apparent when I first go through here, especially on the dry fly. I'll tie this off with a few turns of wire, or a few turns of thread. That wire will show when the fly gets wet though. It becomes much more apparent when the fly is wetted down. I'll anchor that wire down, and then to break this off, because it's a little heavier than the wire that we've used elsewhere, I'm going to helicopter this, and I'll just grab the wire and twist it around a few times until it breaks off. That saves me from having to cut it with my scissors, which could damage them, and it saves me the stub end of wire that would be sticking out the back. Now we're going to tie our wing case in. For our wing case, we're going to use a slip of turkey tail quill, and I want this piece to be about as wide as the gap of the hook. Now if you measure down here at the base of the stem, it's going to be a little wider. You can see that this tapers down as it comes toward the tip. We're going to tie this feather in by its tip end with the inside of the feather up. The ugly inside of the feather is going to be facing up, so this is the direction it'll be tied in. Ultimately we'll fold this feather up where the pretty outside will show, but we want to tie it in by the tip with the inside up. So I'll cut this segment out. I'm going to trim the tip square. You can see on this feather it's pretty dark here toward the tip. I get it down into some nice modeling down here. The reason I want to tie this in by the tip end is this feather is much thinner in cross section on the tip end than it is on the butt section. The butt end of this feather is much taller, and it tends to want to split if you tie it in that way. So I'm going to tie it in by the tip end. But before I do that, I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to overlap my thread onto the front edge of the abdomen just slightly here, back to about the 60-40 point. I dubbed up to 75%. I'm going to bring my thread back to about the 60-40 point. I want a nice overlap between the abdomen and the thorax. I'm going to take my turkey quill. I'm going to lay it down on top of the fly, and the easiest way to do this is set it right flat on top of the fly and put your thumb down on top of it. Then I'll take my other thumb and just press it in place. Because this is a sheet of material, if I try to pinch it down, it's going to want to fold and split. So the easiest thing to do is just put your thumb down on top of it to press it in place. I'm going to take a loose turn of thread around and tighten toward me to lock that down right at that 60-40 point. And I'll just wrap forward over those stub ends. Very rarely will I come in and snip any of that off. I think it's just as easy to bind it down with a few turns of thread, and it saves the step. Now, one thing that I want to check before I go on is I'll lift this wing case up and make sure I don't have any thread showing behind where I tied that in. And I'm looking pretty good there. So we're going to come in and dub our thorax now. Now, the thorax on this is going to be some of that darker dubbing that we mixed up. And this is going to pick out a little buggier than the dubbing that we used for the abdomen. And you can see I've got most of my bulk already in there. Between tying in the wing case and overlapping the front end of the abdomen, we're not going to need a ton of dubbing to build up this thorax. So I'm going to start this dubbing on the thread, and I'm going to work down, trying to keep this as even as possible. I'm going to add just a touch more. Now, in the event that I don't need all this dubbing, because this is a shorter fiber dubbing, it'll be easier to remove as well. Now, one thing we want to be aware of here is we've got a bit of a taper from the base of the wing case down to the hook eye, and note that we've still got about an eye length worth of bare space behind the eye. If I were to try to dub this dubbing from the back to the front, as I come down that slope, the dubbing's going to want to slide down that hill. So to get around that, I'm going to work forward. So my first turn of dubbing is just behind our index point. And then I'll work backwards from there. So I'm going to work from the front to the back in this case, up to the base of the wing case. Make sure I overlap there. And I've still kind of mirrored that taper that was on the underbody. I want to square that off a bit. I want the thorax to be a little more square-edged on the front particularly. And when I run out of dubbing, I want to be up in my bare index point. Now, before I go and pull my wing case over, I want to make sure I've got a thread base in that index point so I don't have the feather tied to bare metal. I'm now going to grab my wing case feather. I'm going to pull it forward in my thread hand. I'm going to bring the thread up and over it. Now, one trick to keeping this wing case centered is note that I'm holding the thread up with the wing case. I'm going to now draw the feather down on top by pulling down on the thread. If I were to do this conventionally, where I'll pull this up and just push it, you can see that wing case will become off-centered. To keep the wing case centered, I'm going to pull it over the top of the fly and let the thread draw it straight down on top so it's centered on top of the hook. Anchor everything down good and tight, and I'll trim the stub ends of that off. Now, we're going to build a little bit of a thread head here, and all this thread head is going to do is cover the stub ends of that wing case. If it only takes 4 turns to cover it, only use 4 turns. Don't make 20 turns where 4 will do. So I've made 4 or 5 turns there, and I'm going to whip finish right over the thread head, and that will contribute somewhat to the head diameter as well. Now, one thing I always like to do to a hare's ear is pick the dubbing out a bit. And in this case, I'm going to go just on the thorax. So I'm going to pick from the sides, on both sides of the fly, to pick some of that dubbing out along the thorax, just under the wing case. And I don't want to go too crazy with it, because you can make the fly get a lot bigger than you really meant it to be. Just to kind of give it some legs there along the front end of the fly. But that's a great little fly that will teach you a lot of techniques to tie different flies as well. Everything nymph-wise is pretty well based off of these same steps.